We have a quorum, and I'm calling the meeting to order. Et j'aimerais vous souhaiter le bienvenue à la 11e.
I'd like to welcome you to the 11th meeting of the Special Joint Committee on Physician-Assisted Dying.
Nova Scotia and co-chair of this committee and chairing it today, along with my co-chair colleague, Don Oliphant, a member of Parliament for Don Valley West. We have in this session, which will go from 5 to 6 p.m., we have two groups presenting. First of all, we have His Eminence, Cardinal Thomas Collins, Archbishop of Toronto, and with him, Lawrence Worthen, Executive Director of the Christian Medical and Dental Society of Canada and the Coalition for Health Care and Conscience. We welcome you. I will remind you that together you have a total of 10 minutes for your presentation. And appearing by video conference, we have Vida Eng, from the Executive Director of the Canadian Unitarian Council. And Ms. Eng, you have 10 minutes as well. And because it's technology, and we already know you've been shunted around Toronto a bit with something happening at the first site, we're going to invite you to present first. Just before you start, I want to remind the witnesses and everybody that the committee members, when called, have 5 minutes in total for their question and the response. So both the questioners should be efficient with language, and the responders, if you could be as direct in your answers, it would be much appreciated. So with that, I invite Ms. Eng to present.
Thank you for the opportunity to present before this joint committee. As far back as the early 1970s, the Canadian Unitarian Council has advocated for the right of a terminally ill patient to make decisions about the time and manner of their death. We were involved as intervener in the Taylor and Carter cases in 2012 and 2014. And in this presentation, I wish to emphasize the following. First, around eligibility criteria and competency. We are of the belief that the competency requirement should apply at the time of the initial request for physician-assisted dying and at the provision of the requested treatment. However, we do recognize that patients with an irremediable condition may deteriorate at any time. Therefore, we think that once informed consent has been fully obtained, this should stand, and that decisions around the manner and time of death should be made on an individual basis. For example, where an individual suffers from dementia or lapses into a coma after providing the initial informed consent. We also believe that the consent to determination of life must be made freely, without coercion or pressure, and after the patient has had a chance to consider all treatment options. In terms of the grievous and irremediable condition, we believe that there are a number of illnesses, disabilities, and conditions that cover this range of description. And we believe that the condition that causes the suffering that is intolerable to the individual should be defined by the individual and not by any outside body. We believe really strongly that there should not be a predetermined list of illnesses, conditions, or symptoms, as the experience varies from person to person. On the matter of equitable access, we believe that publicly funded institutions should be required to provide physician-assisted dying on their premises. Other healthcare professionals may provide assisted dying medication, especially in situations where there is no physician available or willing, or in the more remote regions. In areas which are remote, ways must be found to allow patients equitable access so that there are no delays and that the same level of compassionate care may be provided. In circumstances where the physician is unwilling to provide assisted dying, mechanisms must be in place for individuals to access this without undue stress. We also believe that Physicians and healthcare practitioners should be able to make their own decisions based on their conscience. They should be able to refuse the provision of assisted dying if this is their personal belief. They should be able to make these decisions without fear of reprisals or consequences. The institutions for which they work should not be able to levy any kind of consequences upon them. When this is the case, when a physician decides not to provide assisted dying, the patient must be given full access to other means. There should be no impediments to individuals requesting assisted dying, and institutions should not prevent patients from accessing this care. There needs to be a carefully thought out system for transfer of care so that patients are not denied compassionate treatment, and to make sure that this is done without additional stress or trauma to the individual. Patients' needs need to come before doctors' wishes. Nor should provincial, territorial, or municipal governments allow any roadblocks or barriers to exist for patients to access assisted dying. Why does the Canadian Unitarian Council feel so strongly about this? As a religious institution, we realize that different faiths have different beliefs, but we do not think that the views of any one faith can be used to restrict the freedoms of other individuals. As a religious body, we have had a history of supporting choice in all manner of things, even when it hasn't been popular to do so, such as choice in abortion, the rights of the lesbian, gay, bisexual community, or the call of women to be ordained. We've often taken the path that hasn't been popular, but we feel that this is the right thing to do. And it's very much in keeping with Canadian values to put the needs and wishes of Canadians ahead of the values of individual doctors and institutions, and to respect each person's dignity at the most traumatic periods of their lives. We also think that in order to safeguard good processes, reviews should take place after each instance of physician-assisted death. These are necessary, but we do not think that a review before the medication is in the best interest of the patient in case it leads to delays. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Very much. And now, Your Eminence, I will turn to you and your colleague. Please make your presentation.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for allowing us this opportunity to provide input on such a profoundly important subject. I appear today on behalf of the Coalition for Healthcare and Conscience. Joining me is Larry Worth, the Executive Director of the Christian Medical and Dental Society of Canada. We are like-minded organizations committed to protecting conscience rights for health practitioners and facilities. In addition to the Catholic Archdiocese of Toronto and the Christian Medical and Dental Society of Canada, our members also include the Catholic Organization for Life and Family, the Canadian Federation of Catholic Physician Societies, the Canadian Catholic Bioethics Institute, and Canadian Physicians for Life. I will address two issues: conscience protection for healthcare workers and palliative care and support services for the vulnerable. For centuries, faith-based organizations and communities have cared for the most vulnerable in our country, and they do so to this day. We know what it is to journey with those who are facing great suffering in mind and body, and we are committed to serving them with a compassionate love that is rooted in faith and expressed through the best medical care available. We were brought together by a common mission: to respect the sanctity of human life, which is a gift of God, to protect the vulnerable, and to promote the ability of individuals and institutions to provide health care without being forced to compromise their moral convictions. It is because of this mission that we cannot support or condone assisted suicide or euthanasia. Death is the natural conclusion of the journey of life in this world. As the author of the book of Ecclesiastes wisely observed long ago, the dust returns to the earth as it once was, and the life breath returns to the God who gave it. Death comes to us all, and so patients are fully justified in refusing burdensome and disproportionate treatment that only prolongs the inevitable process of dying. But there is an absolute difference between dying and being killed, It is our moral conviction that it is never justified for a physician to help take a patient's life under any circumstances. We urge you to consider carefully the drastic negative effects physician-assisted suicide will have in our country. Killing a person will no longer be seen as a crime, but instead will be treated as a form of health care. According to the Supreme Court, adults at any age, not just those who are near death, may request assisted suicide. Following the lead of some European countries whose experience with assisted suicide and euthanasia we disregard at our peril, the Provincial Territorial Expert Advisory Group has already gone beyond the restriction of assisted suicide to adults and has proposed that children be included. The right to be put to death will, in practice, become, in some cases, the duty to be put to death, as subtle pressure is brought to bear on the vulnerable. Those called to the noble vocation of healing will instead be engaged in killing, with a grievous effect both upon the integrity of a medical profession committed to do no harm and upon the trust of patients and those from whom they seek healing. Even those doctors who support this legalization in principle may be uneasy when they experience its far-reaching implications. The strong message from the Supreme Court is unmistakable. Some lives are just not worth living. We passionately disagree. In light of all this, it is clear that reasonable people with or without religious faith can have a well-founded moral conviction in their conscience that prevents them from becoming engaged in any way in the provision of assisted suicide and euthanasia. They deserve to be respected. It is essential that the government ensure that effective conscience protection is given to healthcare providers, both institutions and individuals. They should not be forced to perform actions that go against their conscience or to refer the action to others, since that is the moral equivalent of participating in the act itself. It's simply not right or just to say, you do not have to do what is against your conscience, but you have to be sure it happens. Our worth as a society will be measured by the support we give to the vulnerable. People facing illness may choose to end their lives for reasons of isolation, discouragement, loneliness, poverty, even though they may have many years yet to live. What does it say about us as a society when the ill and the vulnerable in our midst feel like burdens? Often a plea for suicide is a cry for help. Society should respond with care and compassionate response for these vulnerable people, not with death. Proper palliative care to date is not available to the majority of Canadians. It is a moral imperative for all levels of government in our country to focus attention and resources on providing that care, which offers effective medical control of pain and, even more importantly, loving accompaniment of those who are approaching the inevitable end of life on earth. Now, Larry Worthen will now provide more detail about some specific recommendations.
Thank you, Cardinal Collins. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, His Eminence has provided you some insight into our concerns about how legalizing physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia will impact vulnerable patients. Provided they can consent, people with disabilities such as rheumatoid arthritis, paraplegia, or those with mental health difficulties could qualify for assisted death according to the criteria set down by the courts. Often people who have these challenges are struggling in a world with many barriers. The danger is that they will choose assisted death because of the failure of our society to provide the necessary support. Through increased access to palliative care, disability, chronic disease, and mental health services, Canada can significantly reduce the number of people who see death as the only viable option to end their isolation, their feeling of being a burden, and their sense of worthlessness. Our concern for our patients extends to our concern for conscience protection. Recently, the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario passed a policy requiring referral for assisted death. A referral is the recommendation or a handing over of care to another doctor on the advice of the referring physician. The requirement to refer forces our members to act against their moral conviction that assisted suicide or euthanasia will in fact harm their patients. If they refuse to refer, they will risk disciplinary action by the Ontario College. When a proposed practice calls into question such a foundational value of the common good of society and the foundational value of the very meaning of a profession, a healthcare worker has the right to object. A healthcare worker does not lose their right to moral integrity just because they choose a particular profession. In the landmark Carter case, the Supreme Court of Canada said that no physician could be forced to participate in assisted death. They also said that this was a matter that engaged the charter freedoms of conscience and religion. It is not in the public interest to discriminate against a category of people based upon their moral convictions and religious beliefs. This does not create a more tolerant, inclusive, or pluralistic society, and it is ironic that this is being done all in the name of choice. Fortunately, 6 other colleges have not required referral. We have enumerated several possible options for the federal government to ensure that these charter rights are respected all across the country. We have a legal opinion that we will make available to the committee that lists 5 ways that the federal government could protect conscience rights. If the federal government does not act, then we risk a patchwork quilt of regulatory practices and a serious injustice being done to some very conscientious, committed, and capable doctors. Despite our concerns, members of our coalition will not obstruct the patient's decision should this legislation be put in place. The federal government could establish a mechanism allowing patients direct access to a third-party information and referral service that would provide them with an assessment once they have discussed assisted death with their own doctor and clearly decided they wish to seek it. Our members do not wish to abandon their patients in their most challenging moments of vulnerability and illness. When we get a request for assisted death, should this legislation go ahead, we'll probe to determine the underlying reason for the request to see if there are alternatives for management. We'll provide complete information about all available medical options, including assisted death. However, our members must step away from the process, allowing the patient to seek the assessment directly once they have a firm commitment to take that path. Like our coalition, the Canadian Medical Association has stated that doctors should not be required to do referrals for assisted suicide or euthanasia. It's important to remind the committee that no other foreign jurisdiction requires physician compliance in assisted death through referral. In closing, we highlight 4 areas of serious concern: the need for improved patient services, including palliative, mental health care, and support for people with disabilities; protection of the vulnerable; provisions that physicians, nurses, and other healthcare professionals not be required to refer for or perform assisted death or be discriminated against because of their moral convictions; and finally, protection for healthcare facilities like hospitals, nursing homes, and hospices who are unable to provide assisted death on their premises because of their organizational values. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you very much. And I'll now turn to our colleagues and Madam Shanahan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My question is addressed to Monsignor Collins and Mr. Worthen. I just want it on the record. I am a practicing Catholic, although I say practicing because I'm not very good yet. And you can be assured that I have reflected and prayed on this matter greatly, both before and now during this time that I am a member of Parliament. And how I have had to make my peace with my own personal beliefs. And I know what I believe, and I know that if I'm ever faced with the choice, I'd like to think that I will be able to make the choice that my faith requires of me. But that being said, I'm here as a parliamentarian, and I cannot impose my beliefs on others. And I am very conscious of the fact that we have to make recommendations for legislation that are going to address the beliefs and values of all Canadians. So given that the Carter decision, and I am relieved to hear that you acknowledge the Carter decision, as indeed we must. What are the how do you reconcile then your approach, given that so many Canadians and Catholic Canadians look to faith-based care for that end-of-life care? How do you reconcile that end of the process of delivering end-of-life care to Canadians, and in the event that they ask for physician-assisted dying?
Well, Larry, he'll give some of the details of the. I would say, first of all, we do not agree, obviously, with the with assisted suicide and euthanasia. We think this is a direction which leads all kinds of people into tremendous suffering and is not good for our whole community. It is really a thing which causes great ultimate suffering for all of the most vulnerable, including those who are considering suicide, things of that nature. We know, though, that obviously, as you say, people are proceeding along this path in response to the Supreme Court judgment. But individuals, and I would not presume to say that I'm going to, by my words or something, stop that from proceeding. This is the parliamentary process that's in place. It is not for me to engage in it. But I would simply say that there are many, many Canadians, especially those most deeply, intimately involved in caring for people, who are profoundly troubled by our country moving in this direction. And that whatever procedures you are in the course of setting up, that those who have that profound conviction must be, I think their conscience needs to be protected. And I'm glad the Unitarian Church also agrees with that. I think not only individuals, but also institutions. There are ways of providing protection for conscience and dealing with this issue, and I think Larry has mentioned that, and I want to give more detail on that.
Yes, the proposal, which we will leave behind, was one that we discussed at length with the Canadian Medical Association, which they have approved, which basically shows the physician articulating their conscience issue around assisted suicide and euthanasia with the patient, having the dialogue and discussion with the patient, giving the patient information about all viable options, but then simply stepping back from the process and allowing the patient to have direct access to an assessment for assisted death. Our hope would be that either the federal government or the provincial governments would create an information and referral service so that after patients have had the discussion with their own doctor, that they are able to access that directly. We've checked that out with moral theologians, both on the evangelical and Roman Catholic side, and they find that morally acceptable. This seems to us to be a way for our physicians to continue to care for the patient, not affect the physician-patient relationship, and also allow the patient to make their decisions without there being any obstruction from the physician.
So you would be open to this duty to inform then, if not an active referral, but to inform another body that the patient has requested physician-assisted suicide? We
differ slightly from the recommendations of the provincial territorial expert advisory group. They suggested that it would be the physician's responsibility to inform the third party. Our feeling is that it would be unacceptable for us to have to take that responsibility, and that the actual patient could be the one to contact. In the situation where the patient is unable to contact, which would normally happen in an institution, then we could look to a patient transfer. That would be the opportunity then for another physician in the facility to be able to respond to the patient's concerns.
Thank you. Mr. Warwa.
Thank you to the witnesses for being here. Very interesting. I researched the Unitarian Council, and I didn't see any hospitals that had been established in the Unitarian Church, but I did find many that are faith-based Catholic hospitals. There has, and I appreciate the question from MP Shanahan and her sharing that we should not impose our beliefs on other Canadians. But there's this balance of faith and doing what's right in our own hearts, too. My question is, and also there's been comment around this table, that the doctor's conscience should be protected, and maybe not to do it themselves, but to refer And I'm understanding that you believe, and I've heard from most physicians, actually I think it was 70% of physicians do not want to have to be required to refer. 30%, which is 24,000 physicians, are willing to practice this. So focusing on the 70%, that I think most Canadians believe that they should not be forced to perform such as suicide or euthanasia. They should not be forced to refer. But there's been a question, I think, from one of our senators that institutions, BRICS, do not have conscience. If you could comment, do institutions have a value system that would say yes or no? Should they have the right to say no as an institution? And is there a possibility of having possibly harmonizing system where you have institutions, hospitals, like a Catholic hospital, that is not bound because they're providing health care, but they could be known for a hospital that provides health and natural death, and there could be some hospitals that provide that other choice. Could you comment on that?
I think it's very true to say that institutions are not bricks and mortar. You don't look around and say this is institutions are made of people. Institutions are like the Sisters of St. Joseph, the Grey Nuns, all the various groups who brought loving health care to this place. They're not things, they're communities of people. And they have values. That's why people come to them. That's why they seek them out. They know when they go to, for example, a hospital, like I think of St. Michael's Hospital, St. Joseph's Hospital, Providence Center, which has a wonderful palliative care place. They know they can trust when they come to the sisters, when they come to the church, and it's true as well for Jewish and Protestant similar institutions, of which there are many in my own diocese. There are very many that they can trust that we have certain values that we hold to. Those values are important for our whole society. I mean, political parties have values. Other institutions have values. They're not objective things. They're not like material things, and that's a great value for our whole community. These institutions are funded by the government because they do an immense good work. They provide variety, diversity, choice, I might say, to people. And that's very, very important. So I would say that institutions provide the spirit. I think of the one next to where I live, the Urban Angel, St. Michael's. It's a sign of hope for people. And if you would undermine the institution for what it is, our society will be very, very much harmed. Our whole community would be a lot harsher, colder, crueler, without the witness given by communities of faith who are on the ground, on the street, day by day, caring for the most needy. I don't think they should be undermined or attacked.
Anytime. 1 minute. Thank you, Collins. I'm just wondering about the safeguards to ensure the conscience. You said you had some ideas of how physicians that do not want to participate within a federal regime. I had heard that one of the suggestions was that it could be a criminal offense to force someone, a physician or an institution, to force someone to be involved with this. Is this one of the suggestions that you were considering?
Yes, our legal brief has 5 different options in all. One of them would be, just as in some of the provincial college documents, doctors who choose to do euthanasia are protected against discrimination on the part of faith-based institutions. So also we would ask that doctors who do not want to do euthanasia are also protected, and that could be by way of a criminal statute that would make it unlawful for someone to be coerced to participating in this.
An institution.
Thank you. Mr. Rankin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses. I particularly appreciate Cardinal Collins, your strong assertion of the need for our committee to address palliative care, and I really appreciate you putting that on the table. I wanted to, I guess, explore a little bit what Mr. Wara was just saying, presumably to Mr. Worthen, the question. I'm going to read to you from the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, their interim guidance. They talk about physicians must provide an effective referral, quote, to a non-objecting, available, and accessible physician or agency in a timely manner. And in my province of British Columbia, this similar body says, quote, physicians must ensure effective transfer of care for their patients. This is in the context of conscience protection for healthcare providers. Now, you've stated this obligation to refer patients would violate their conscience rights of certain physicians, and instead there should be a mechanism to provide patients with third-party information, assessment, and services. I'm a little concerned, though, because other witnesses have told us that simply providing a person who wishes to exercise their constitutional right can't be limited by a Yellow Pages reference, an 800 number, or a website. So I'm trying to get my head around what you're suggesting, and in particular, how that would affect the right of access, effective right of access for Canadians in remote communities if one were to accede to your recommendation.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a very good one. I think that there needs to be more. Our proposal is not to simply send someone to the Yellow Pages. Far from it. Our doctors are committed to the life and well-being of their patients. So they would want to maintain the physician-patient relationship. They would want to discuss this important decision with their patients. They would want to provide the patient, they would want to spend time determining what the reason for the request is, and they would also want to ensure that the patient was able to get the assessment if they so desired it. They would not want to stand in the way of that. I'm not talking, we should not be talking in this country about having a simple operator at the end of the phone that is going to give someone a number. In my view, we should be responding compassionately to these people because many of these people will need services, support, and help. And so this service that is anticipated by the Canadian Medical Association, I think similar in the provincial territorial expert advisory group recommendations, would be for support services to be made available and for this person to get an appropriate assessment and in a thorough way. We're not talking about sending some of the Yellow Pages. This is in a thorough way. Now, I think that something like this is really important in a more remote community because even in a remote community, you might have one doctor or two doctors, both might be people who are not prepared to participate in assisted death. This will mean that it would be important for that individual to be able to get access to this service. And that service, I think the responsibility is on government to ensure that that service is available and provided.
And I can, if in the time that's available, that's so short, I want to go to the institutional side. We've talked about the conscience of the healthcare provider. I'd like to turn again to the institutional argument and to quite boldly put forward that if an institution of which the Cardinal has spoken receives public funding, shouldn't they be required to provide all Canadians with the constitutional rights that they now have? I understand about the professional, and you've put some good arguments forward, but I'm still at a loss to understand why a body that receives public funding shouldn't be required to be providing constitutional rights that all Canadians now enjoy.
I would say, just to answer that quickly, I would say that it's misreading the Carter decision to say that it requires individual physicians or facilities to provide this service. What it says is that Canadians have the right to this, but it doesn't say that they have a right to it from every individual institution or individual doctor.
There's only one such institution in a remote Northern Ontario community, for example.
Well, this happens all the time in medical care. There are certain procedures that are only provided in certain places. It would be it's up to government. You know, the departments of health cannot shirk their responsibilities here. If this is something that the Supreme Court has mandated, then the departments of health have to find ways to provide these services. And if that means that they have to send a physician out to that individual or bring that physician in, that commonly happens. Like If
there's a hospital in a particular community, they shouldn't be providing that service, even though
Senator Nancy Ruth.
You have said that access should be evenly available and that doctors must transfer patients if they have a conscientious objection. What is the opinion of the Unitarian Council if the hospital is a faith-based hospital who objects to doing physician-assisted death? Not just the doctor.
We understand that We understand that there are many faith-based institutions that provide hospice and palliative care. And it's even more important in those situations that a good, effective process of transfer of care does happen, as we've been talking about, especially in the more remote communities. It is the constitutional right of every Canadian to receive this care, and it is a fine balance between protecting the rights of conscience of the physician and making sure that the rights of the individual patient have not been violated. So a good mechanism needs to exist, whether it's direct doctor referral care or a third-party referral system. It needs to flow smoothly. And I would think that if someone checks into an institution or a hospice facility that is faith-based, they would know ahead of time that there are certain moral values apply. But to go back to the previous question about institutions, if they're publicly funded, we believe that publicly funded institutions should provide this kind of assisted dying. We also believe in the sanctity of life, but we don't think that life should be extended and preserved at all costs. We believe that quality of life is really important as well. There is no dignity, there is no compassion when someone is terminally ill, they're at the end of their life, they can't take care of themselves, their bodies have let them down, they are in pain, and they can't look after themselves. There is no dignity in that. My partner died a little over 2 years ago. He was diagnosed with a condition early in 2000 and lived beyond his original prognosis. He was fortunate enough to receive very good hospice care in a hospice. It was excellent palliative care. But would he have wanted access to physician-assisted dying? Yes, he would have. He was in pain, he was uncomfortable, he was not the person that he knew himself to be. And if we force someone to prolong their life because a physician isn't willing to provide that kind of care, then we're violating their constitutional rights.
Thank you. You did say that there should be a review after death. Could you explain that a bit more?
I think a review process serves to make sure that effective mechanisms are in play. As this practice and this legislation rolls out, we're not going to know what it looks like. So in terms of helping both the institution and the physician make better choices down the road, I think a thorough review of what request was made, how the request was handled, how the institution handled it, and how the physician handled it will help both the institution and the physician.
Who is it that should do
I think it should be an objective party, whether it's a committee put together by various stakeholders. It should not be the institution that provided the care, and it shouldn't be the physician who provided the care, but someone objective.
Can you see?
And I think this is even more.
Can you see this coming under the coroner's office in the provinces? Can you see the coroner's offices be expanded to include this kind of thing? What I'm getting at, is there a need to create a new institution, or can we use what already exists in every province and territory across Canada?
I think the options are there as long as there are no biases built in, as long as there's a process to make sure that the reviews are objective and that there are no preconceived agendas.
Thank you.
Senator Cowan.
Welcome to the witnesses, and thank you for your evidence. Your Eminence, I appreciate your your faith-based opposition to physician-assisted dying, but that's not the issue before us. The court has made a decision, and we're bound by that decision. And physician-assisted dying is a constitutional right for those eligible to access it, and so. And I appreciate the concerns that you've expressed about conscientious objectors and the nobody being forced to participate. But it seems to me, and I'd ask for your comments, that what we're really looking at here is we ought to be looking at it through the eyes of the affected patient, and that it's the rights and beliefs that we might have to be accommodated to meet those rights that the patient has. So I'd like you to turn, perhaps you would wish that there is not going to be a physician-assisted death in this country, but there is. So what precautions, what particular specific precautions should we be recommending be put in place to protect abuse and protect the vulnerable? And I think all of us would want to afford every protection to the vulnerable and to protect. But what specifically should we be recommending that would allow physician-assisted death to proceed, but at the same time providing appropriate protections for the vulnerable?
I'm certainly sure that there are people, many around this table and around the country, who are very much committed to assuring that physician-assisted suicide takes place. And it is a thing, obviously, after the Carter decision. This is the project of this committee. As I have made clear, I don't believe that is the direction the country should be going. And it would be far be it from me to try to, or to be suggesting making it like, should we have 3 doctors, 2 doctors, should we have 1, should we do? I don't believe it should happen. So I can't get into
understand that, Your Eminence, but that's not where we are.
I'm sure other people will be doing that, but I don't believe in the thing itself. What I do believe is that the rights of conscience of people who are constantly involved with compassionately caring for those most in need to be protected. And I also believe that alternatives should be presented, funded, and very directly, and that would be palliative care.
I mean, all of us, again, you're preaching to the choir here, because all of us would believe that there ought to be more readily accessible, better palliative care available to more Canadians. But again, that's not our issue. Our issue is, and maybe Mr. Worthen can address this issue of precisely what is it, what are these, you spoke about protection of the vulnerable as being a concern. What can we do to protect the vulnerable within a regime which permits the constitutional right of eligible persons to access physician-assisted dying?
Well, I'm with the Cardinal on this. I spent some time a year and a half ago with Dr. Theo Boer, who is a medical ethicist in the Netherlands. He was on a euthanasia commission there. Their job was to review cases. And he told me, he indicated, we went through every one of the so-called safeguards that were available in the Dutch statute. And he explained to me about cases that he had where doctors had circumvented those. Studies have shown that in one study showed that in about 20% of cases, doctors were actually performing euthanasia when they thought they were doing palliative sedation. So in my discussion with Dr. Boer, I said, it appears to me that these so-called safeguards are just there to sell the concept of assisted suicide.
Surely if there are safeguards in place and physicians or other health professionals disregard or circumvent those precautions, then that's a disciplinary matter for the College of Physicians and Surgeons or the Nurses Association?
Unfortunately, if you look at what's actually happening in these countries, doctors just get a slap on the wrist.
Well,
they get a letter. They get a letter telling them. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that once you accept the idea that state-sanctioned killing of patients is morally acceptable, and you open it a crack, it becomes almost impossible to find a place to stop that process.
I don't mean to be.
Mr. Aldag?
Thank you. There we go. I'd like to thank everybody for the comments that you've shared, which is giving me much more to think about once again. I know Cardinal Collins, you'd mentioned, you may not want to be involved in forming or shaping, and so I'll put this to the other two panelists. And it's continuing with the question of safeguards. We've heard from some presenters that have come here that we should look at safeguards being medical. So if somebody decides that they may be interested, there's one physician, perhaps 2 physician process with a wait time to be determined. We've heard from other witnesses that they feel that this should be taken away from the medical community and moved into a legal or quasi-legal kind of piece. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on either of those options, or if there's another option on safeguards that we should be contemplating as we mull over how this may actually work out. Again, looking at protections for the vulnerable. How do we create that the appropriate amount of time for reflection by both the patient and the care providers, and within what field? And is there something missing that we haven't considered in that legal or medical realm? And so I just throw that out to both of you for thoughts or comments.
We've done studies of looking at the various countries that have legalized this, and generally speaking, the problem is that the problem you have is that when a patient comes to a doctor and they say they want to die, there are many different factors that could be contributing to that, and many of those could be dealt with. The problem is that if you are expecting a physician to be able to do the full evaluation required to ensure that that person is not being coerced, no other jurisdiction is willing to put the funding in place to be able to do that properly. When you say that it's a safeguard to have two physicians, in other jurisdictions, there's something called doctor shopping, where if they don't get the answer they want from the first two physicians, then they'll go on to the third, fourth, or fifth physician, and eventually you will find somebody in the jurisdiction who believes in patient autonomy to the extreme, where they will permit, they will just decide because this person wants to die, they should be able to die. So the reality is that we have concerns even with the use of the term safeguard, because it normally means whatever we can put in place to be able to salve our conscience about the fact of how these vulnerable people are going to end up being put to death. The Carter criteria that was put together includes disabled people. So it's so common for our physicians, it happens on a weekly basis, that patients say they want to die because they've had a traumatic emotional incident. They have just been diagnosed with a serious illness. They've just become a paraplegic or a quadriplegic. Any number of factors can generate in a person's mind the desire to end their life. But the question is, do we as a society have the compassion and concern to be able to put the resources in place to assist those people, or will we end up just euthanizing them and basically wash our hands of our responsibility for our fellow people?
Yeah, I did want to hear from our other panelist, which is...
Did you want to hear from Ms.
Yeah, just
Ms. Ng, would you
if you have any
comment on this,
thoughts
please?
on it, just on this idea of safeguards, and so thank you.
Ms. Ng?
The protection of vulnerable peoples is really important, and I think the assessment of competency, I think, is vital to this. We're talking about two different things here, I think. One is the protection of the vulnerable people, and also to make sure that the person seeking assisted dying is really sure that this is what they want. And that's where the careful assessment process comes in. And I think you made a good point. Maybe someone doesn't want to die, they just want to be out of the situation that we're in. And that's where the suicide assessment might come in. If there are other options to help someone deal with mental health issues in a more healthy way, then I think those should be available. However, the difference is when you're talking about someone with an irremediable illness, the road is bleak. Right. So the careful and thorough assessment is really important. The assessment by two physicians is really important. The patient needs to completely understand the consequences of this decision, both on themselves and on their family. They need to know all the treatment options that are available. And I think the key to this is that the patient must must freely choose this option after considering all the treatment options, and that the request for the physician-assisted death must be made by the patient and not another party. Because when you're talking about protecting the vulnerable, there is a fear here that someone else might request the death of this patient, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So the request for the medication must come from the patient and not another party. And I think if the physician suspects that there's any kind of...
Thank you. Mr. Cooper.
Chair, I will provide the balance of my time to Mr. Janis. Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Cardinal Collins, Mr. Worthen, I think you bring a refreshing perspective, and I would say respectfully, it's a perspective that I wish we could have had an opportunity to hear more of at this committee. But I have two specific issues that I'd like to raise, and I'll raise them both at the same time, if that's okay, and then leave the balance of my time to you gentlemen to respond to them as you wish. My understanding is that the idea of dignity, a word that we hear often in this committee, is very important in the Catholic tradition as well. But sometimes I think we use the words like dignity and compassion without a certain precision to them. So I wonder if Cardinal Collins, if you could talk to us a little bit about the understanding of dignity in the Catholic tradition and give us a little bit of a definition. Of course, we would all like to see people have dignity at the point of their death, and perhaps then we need to think a little bit about what dignity really means. Then the second issue I want to hear more about is the subject of palliative care. I think all of us agree here that palliative care is good, that we would like to see more palliative care. But I think we need to go further than that and recognize that it is not just desirable but necessary to provide people with palliative care. And this was made clear by the report of the expert panel that a request for physician-assisted death, I'm quoting here, cannot be truly voluntary if the option of proper palliative care is not available to alleviate a person's suffering. In other words, it isn't a genuinely autonomous choice at all if we continue to provide palliative care to such a tiny fraction of Canadians. And in fact, if we proceed with this and don't respect conscience for institutions, I fear that we'll see the closure of more faith-based palliative care services who aren't willing to provide this. So I wonder if you can comment both on the issue of what dignity means and also on the centrality of palliative care.
Okay, maybe I'll start with the very important point you raised concerning dignity. And I think everyone may have different opinions on that or different views. I would say dignity comes from within the person, himself or herself. I would think even a person without faith would see that in a purely human way, the dignity of the human person. It doesn't come from the circumstances around them. From the point of view of faith, it comes from those that we see people as a child of God, as someone who has inherent dignity. Every person must be treated with reverence. Did John Paul II have dignity? When he was a 58-year-old pope skiing down mountains, he had dignity. Did he have dignity when he was in the last years of his life, when he couldn't, he had many different things which were, his body was breaking down? I would say he had dignity then, and he had dignity at the other times as well. Dignity comes from within the human person. I would say dignity comes with the reverence we give to a person, and that's why we should surround them and care for them. Think of Mother Teresa. Do the people she served, do they have dignity? Yes, they did. And she tried to help them in their suffering and care. Dignity comes from within. Dignity, I would say, comes from God. It is something that we are all, and what we are doing, and we've been doing for hundreds and a couple thousand years, is surrounding a person, reverencing their dignity. And that's why we don't believe it's right to kill them. We think that's just not right. That is not the way to dignity. On palliative care, I think we need to not only talk about it, I think it needs to be dealt with at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels. I think on certainly the private level. I can tell you in my own diocese, I can't speak for other religious groups. We have various initiatives. Just this afternoon, I got a proposal for another palliative care place that we're going to be thinking of putting in the center of Toronto. We do this. We're on the ground. We're doing it. We're caring. But I do think it would help a lot if this was funded. I mean, what are we spending money on in our country? I would think caring for those who have dignity inherent within them from the first moment of their life to the time when they go to the end of this life, at the end of their earthly journey. And so I think we need to not just talk about it, I think we need to do something about it.
Senator Seidman.
Ms. Ng, if I might ask you a little more about the point you made about review after a death. We have heard, for example, that the review is very important. Data collection and oversight could then lead to a review of the legislation in an ongoing way to update, change over time. And we have heard that this could be a joint federal, provincial, territorial kind of oversight. Would you be able to, because you mentioned the importance of review, would you be able to comment on this, please?
I think we learn from mistakes. Going out, we know very little about how it's going to play out in Canadian society. Opinions are very dichotomized around this, and I think a review would serve all sides in this situation. Because if we proceed without review, we won't know what we've done well, and we won't know what we've improved. We won't know if palliative care actually may take care of a lot of the issues that people who are irremediably ill face. A review process, if it's a joint federal, provincial, municipal venture, will provide answers to a lot of the questions that we're asking now in this situation, and help us make sure that, one, processes that are working well get improved upon and get shared, and two, the processes that aren't working so well need to be improved on, especially in the cases where areas are more remote, in cases where physicians are acting on their conscience, and in cases where maybe not enough education or information is shared with healthcare practitioners. I think we cannot afford to assume that the rollout of this will be smooth.
And what kind of information could you see being collected in this approach in terms of monitoring, oversight, and then a feedback loop into the legislative process?
Okay. For example, how assessment of competency is done, how physicians have the conversation with their patients, whether or not the patients feel comfortable enough to broach the subject, knowing that there are going to be physicians who are not comfortable providing this kind of care, whether the institution has enough resources to support both the patient and its own medical personnel when these conversations are going on. Whether two physicians are present, if that makes a difference in terms of the request from the patient, what kind of medication is used, whether there are requests from the patient to self-terminate or whether the medication is going to be administered by a physician. Whether the family members are involved or not, I think is important. And that also speaks to matters of coercion and protecting the vulnerable. Patients might feel a subtle pressure from family members to either act one way or another way. And I think that those intangibles, I think, are also important for the review process to pick up on. And one of the important things, I've talked about the equitable access, how patients in the remote areas access this care. His Eminence has talked about having a third-party referral process. In principle, we don't object to that, but if it puts more barriers and roadblocks in the way of the patients requesting this care, then, and if it doesn't work very well, then a better mechanism needs to be produced.
You have 40 seconds.
Would you see that, we have heard that nurse practitioners, other medical professionals could be involved in actually administering the process, the death for the patient. Could you see that as well?
We could see that happening as long as the proper information, education, training, and support was provided for healthcare professionals who would be involved in administering the DAM. We don't say that physicians should be the only one because we know that circumstances are different around the country, especially in more remote areas. So yeah, we are open to the option of other healthcare professionals being involved,
Thank you very much.
both in administrating the medication and in being support.
Thank you very much. Thank you, witnesses, for being here with us today, colleagues for their questions, and we need to turn this around in 2 or 3 minutes for the next session, and with that, I suspend the meeting.
Thank you very much. We'll be disconnecting, and thank you for appearing before the committee. Have a nice day.
I'm calling the meeting back into session. And in this session, we have 3 panels. We have from the Canadian Council of Imams, Sikander Hashmi, who will be speaking on their behalf. And we have 2 panels appearing by video conference. The Center for Addiction and Mental Health, represented by Dr. Tariq Raji, Chief Geriatric Psychiatry, and Kristen Taylor, Vice President of Legal Services. And from the Canadian Pediatric Society, Dr. Don Davies, Chair, Bioethics Committee, and Mary Sharif, Associate Professor of Law and Associate Dean, Academic at the University of Manitoba. Now, I, once again, for the benefit of the witness groups, will indicate that each group has 10 minutes in total, and our committee members have 5 minutes question and answer. Mr. Genus.
Very brief point of order. Another member and I were timing during my speaking time, and I think I was about 45 seconds short in terms of when you stopped the time. I'm sure there was no ill intention there, but I just wonder if maybe that time could be applied to another member on our side.
According to the clerk's thing, I said 20 seconds to Mark, but it was 22 seconds, and mine was 25. In that, I have been routinely cutting them off at that point. If it's 30 seconds or more and they don't get the answer in, I ask the witness to provide a written answer afterwards. Thank you very much. With that, I will also continue the process that we invite the groups by video conference to appear first, just in case there's a technological glitch, and I will go in the order they're listed in the order paper in front of me, and that means I'm going to invite the Center for Addiction and Mental Health to present first. Please.
Thank you. Members of the Special Joint Committee on Physician-Assisted Dying, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to share our perspectives on this extremely important topic. My name is Tariq Raji. I'm the Chief of Geriatric Psychiatry at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH. I'm joined by my colleague Kristen Taylor, Vice President of Legal Services. CAMH is one of Canada's largest mental health and addictions academic health science centers. We combine clinical care, research, and education to transform the lives of people affected by mental illness or addiction. We have over 500 inpatient beds, 3,000 staff, over 300 physicians, and over 100 scientists. We treat over 30,000 patients each year. PAD, as it relates to mental illness, is an extremely complex topic. The Supreme Court did not explicitly define specific medical conditions that would be eligible for PAD, but ruled that the competent adult person must have a grievous and a remediable medical condition, including an illness, disease, or disability that causes enduring physical or psychological suffering that is intolerable to the individual in the circumstances of his or her condition. This means that mental illness may be eligible for PAD. But should mental illness be eligible for PAD? And if so, how should we address it within a therapeutic clinical relationship? How do we ensure that safeguards are in place to protect those whose mental illnesses make them vulnerable to suicidal ideations? We do not have the answers to these questions yet. These are issues that we continue to struggle with at CAMH. We have convened a working group of clinical, legal, ethics, and policy experts from across our organization who are attempting to answer these questions and determine the impact that PAD will have on our patients, clinicians, and organization. Kristen joins me today as the co-chair of this committee. What we would like to share with the Special Joint Committee today are 2 key insights from our expert working group that we hope will assist in developing a federal framework on physician-assisted dying. First insight is, should mental illness be considered irremediable? Mental illness is typically chronic and episodic. Following the natural history of mental illness, some individuals have persistent symptoms, some experience worsening in symptoms, and some recover even from illnesses like schizophrenia. To date, we cannot predict who will be on what trajectory. Further, we have some effective treatments for mental illness and some knowledge to guide us with respect to personalizing treatments. However, we are still far from predicting what treatments will work for a particular person. The symptoms of mental illness that persist, worsen, or remit include thoughts of suicide. However, the minority of patients with mental illness die from suicide. And again, while we have good knowledge about risk factors for suicide and some interventions that have been shown to reduce suicidality, we still cannot predict when a suicide will happen. This natural history is in contrast with terminal illnesses and some chronic physical illnesses, which are irremediable in that a proximal death is an eventual outcome. Thus, mental illness may be grievous to an individual. Symptoms can cause enduring psychological and sometimes physical suffering. However, suffering should not be equated with an irremediable nature, and the lack of an inevitable and predictable death by natural history provides us with an opportunity to deliver recovery-based treatment. A recovery-based approach to mental health care, which we provide at CAMH, focuses on hope and developing the skills that are needed to live with the mental illness and its symptoms. We do not just focus on treating or curing the illness. Similarly, people with mental illness may be vulnerable to the impact of the social determinants of health. They may live in poverty, have poor housing, and lack social support. These circumstances may exacerbate suffering and a person's perception that their illness is irremediable. Again, part of recovery-based care is for mental health professionals to work with people to help them cope and address these reversible causes of suffering. Therefore, within a clinical recovery-based environment, there is always the potential for mental illness to be irremediable. I would like to use a clinical example to illustrate the points I talked about. A 73-year-old woman with lifelong history of bipolar disorder, recurrent, and a persistent desire to die, driven by a sense of futility and of being limited by her illness and the cognitive deficits, the attention problems, the planning deficits that are due to this illness. The patient was married once, and now she has an adult daughter and a granddaughter. She also has a neighbor with whom she has limited contact. Her bipolar illness is responsive to medications. However, despite good response, she has the persistent wish to die. During her treatment, my discussions with her around death was focused on acknowledging her wish, respecting it, but also confining it. I focused on exploring with her the possibility of strengthening her relationship with her daughter through regular visits and meals together. This evolved to regular babysitting that her daughter and her son-in-law depended on. This new form of her relationship provided her with an unexpected sense of satisfaction and meaningfulness. These new feelings and experiences did not eliminate her wish to die, but ran in parallel and competed with it during her daily life. We also explored her ability to consolidate her relationship with her neighbor, who ended up having a stroke, and the patient became part of his network of caregivers. This therapeutic work with her took about 3 years. The lack of an inevitable and proximal death allowed this work to happen. Further, throughout the 3 years, what deterred her from committing suicide was the possibility of pain of medical sequelae if suicide was not successful, and the, quote, shame, unquote, that she would have left her daughter with. With the availability of a painless death option and the, quote, unquote, sanction by a physician have eliminated the obstacles of pain and shame and interfered with the completion of this therapeutic work. The second point that we want to present to you is that there must be safeguards in place to ensure people with mental illness truly have the capacity to consent to PAD. In addition to the points I made previously about the natural course of the mental illness and its social determinants, individuals with mental illness experience distorted perceptions due to the illness and its consequences. When a person is experiencing an acute episode of their illness, such as a major depressive episode or an acute psychotic episode or a manic episode, it's not uncommon for them to have severely distorted beliefs about themselves, the world, and their future. Sometimes this sense of helplessness and worthlessness and hopelessness continues even when the symptoms of the mental illness are better controlled. Thus, these distortions raise questions about the capacity to make PAD requests during both the acute and less acute phases of the illness. In addition, it is during the phases of relative wellness that recovery-based approaches to care are critical to change these distorted beliefs that have often been reinforced by lifelong experiences with recurrent mental illness, associated stigma, and sometimes abuse or neglect due to this illness. Again, I would like to use a clinical example to illustrate these points. A 55-year-old man with a long history of chronic schizophrenia, with onset that occurred when he was 18 years old. But even before the full manifestation of the illness, this man was considered as awkward and bizarre at school, bullied by classmates, was unable to excel in several academic or social activities, and continued to experience some failures since the full break of his first episode, including failure to maintain a job, failure to have a romantic relationship, and a failure to maintain the relationships he had before the illness. It is not hard to see the lack of capacity when this person is experiencing an acute psychotic episode. But what about when he is not experiencing an acute episode? Wouldn't these repeated failures and maltreatment be contributing to a sense of worthlessness and hopelessness? This distorted and learned view of self can potentially change in response to a recovery-based treatment, and not only treatment that addresses the acute psychosis. In both examples, we recognize that there will be some individual with mental illness who will persistently perceive that they have suffering from an irremediable illness. These individuals may also argue that they are capable of making this decision. We believe that in these situations, an objective decision of the irremediable nature of a person's illness must be made by a board versed in these issues, such as the Consent and Capacity Board in Ontario. Members of the Special Joint Committee, thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you today. There are no easy answers when looking at PAD and mental illness. What I have attempted to do today is lay out the very real challenges and concerns that affect us at CAMH as a recovery-based organization that aims to transform the lives of people with mental illness. We hope that sharing our thoughts and recommendations will assist you as you move forward with your work. Kristen and I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now turn to the Canadian Pediatric Society and invite your presentation.
Thank you for inviting us to speak with you today. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I'm a law professor who's been researching issues around physician-assisted suicide and palliative care since approximately 2008, and I was an expert witness on comparative laws for jurisdictions that passed termination of life legislation for the Carter case. So jumping right in terms of legislative response, one possibility would be to construe Carter, of course, as narrowly as possible, which would be to construe it to the specific facts of the case. But of course, you could always use Carter as a legislative entry point to include individuals and medical conditions not deliberated or decided upon by the Supreme Court. Today I'm here to speak to the matter of children, and with respect to children, I would argue that you should not go beyond the Supreme Court's pronouncement. In termination of life legislation, there are two main organizing streams when it comes to deciding whose request for physician-assisted dying can be legally granted. First, there are the substantive criteria, which we understand as the patient qualifiers. So what criteria qualifies a patient for the request to be entertained by a physician? And then there are also the procedural due care criteria, meaning what procedures do you put in place to make sure that the patient has actually met the substantive criteria. As we know, in cracking open the criminal code to allow willing physicians to provide termination of life services without prosecution, the Supreme Court only expressly identified the substantive criteria, namely competent adult, grievous and irremediable condition, enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual, and clear consent to termination of life. The court did not expressly articulate procedural due care criteria, meaning it didn't articulate the safeguards to be implemented to make sure the patient satisfies those 4 to 6 qualifying criteria. So, the Supreme Court, as we know, provided the substantive criteria of adult. And yes, the Supreme Court did not define adult. But again, if we go back to the facts of the case, the court was and could only make a pronouncement on those facts. Non-adults were simply not part of the equation. So first, I would argue that it's not arbitrary to exclude non-adults from qualifying criteria in any first iteration of Canadian termination of life legislation. Again, there is no evidence on the issue of children or adolescents before the court. But also note this evidentiary finding by the trial judge as articulated by the Supreme Court. While there is no clear societal consensus on physician-assisted dying, there is a strong consensus that it would only be ethical with respect to voluntary adults who are competent, informed, grievously, and irremediably ill. So secondly, there's a massive ethical question as to whether children and adolescents should be able to qualify in the first instance for lethal injection. This ethical question was not considered in Carter, and to the best of my knowledge, it has not been fully considered by Canadians. There is no ethical data on minors to inform the Canadian legal analysis, and Dr. Davies will speak more to the issue of data. Third, the argument is being made that the law has already allowed mature minors to make medical decisions, even if it would result in their death. But let's think about that a little more closely. In those death cases, the decision is about rejection of treatment, whereby if the child rejects treatment, the child runs the risk of dying. This is an entirely different consideration for children when children are expected to consent to lethal injection. Fourth, we also see from those cases, the case law, the Canadian case law, that if the odds of survival are good with treatment, the court will override a minor's refusal. We know that Carter does not use the criteria of terminal illness. So how does one figure out the odds of survival for a child whose medical condition is a mental health issue or other form of disability? And this leads me to my fifth and final point, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Davies. Yes, we absolutely have processes that help us to discern a child's capacity and maturity for a particular decision. But the process for determining a minor's capacity does not answer the question, does not answer the substantive question. It was more than just an acknowledgement of adults' capacity that actually drove the Carter result.
Hi, I'm Dawn Davies, and I'm a palliative care physician at the Stollery Children's Hospital in Alberta, and I'm here today as a representative of the Canadian Pediatric Society, where I'm the current chair of the Bioethics Committee. Thanks for giving the CPS an opportunity to address you. The legislation you are to consider is of particular importance to physicians who care for children and youth, as the issues of eligibility and consent are complex. I'll highlight the relevant clinical dimensions of caring for seriously ill children and how these intersect with the legislation about physician-assisted dying, which I will abbreviate to PAD for the sake of time. The CPS recommends that the complex matter of assessing a minor's capacity be left to the minor's parents and immediate clinical team. Physicians are able to make this assessment as stated in Carter. As has always been the case with mature minors, the greater the risk of serious harm or death, the more vigilant healthcare providers must be in their assessment of one's capacity to make the decision and to ensure that it is free from duress from parents and other authority figures. It's also important to understand that these assessments are sometimes difficult to make and that referral to the courts for life and death cases is not uncommon. And while the provincial and territorial panel suggests that capacity is more relevant than age, they did not consult with pediatric healthcare providers, parents, or minors. The CPS strongly recommends that comprehensive consultation must occur with the following groups prior to further legislation that would include children and adolescents. This is parents of children who are severely disabled or have terminal illness, and those parents who are bereaved after losing children with similar illnesses, with relevant pediatric healthcare professionals and representatives of major religious and child advocacy groups. The Belgian law on euthanasia for adults came into force in 2002 and was extended to include children in 2014, but this has been widely criticized for lack of appropriate broad consultation prior to the inclusion of children. There is also no Canadian pediatric data regarding either requests for physician-assisted dying for minors, the opinion of Canadian pediatricians about PAD, nor their willingness to participate in assisting death of children specifically. We must anticipate the source of requests for PAD, and parents of never competent children deserve special mention. While we understand that proxy decision makers will not be able to request PAD on behalf of any other person, requests from parents for euthanasia of their terminally ill children are neither new nor exceedingly rare. Decision making for treatment of never competent children is based on a best interest standard. It is possible that parents will challenge the courts on the basis that continued life as experienced by their dying or profoundly disabled child is not in their child's best interest. Studies have shown that such requests are more likely if the child has uncontrolled pain. However, palliative care for Canadian children is greatly underserviced, with many community-based health professionals having little to no training in the provision of palliative care to this group. The CPS therefore recommends enhanced pediatric-specific palliative care funded and equipped to care for children and their families in the setting of their choosing, especially their homes. Given the rapid societal shift since the Carter decision and the short timeline to enacting legislation, the CPS strongly enshrines the physician's right to conscientiously object to providing PAD, especially in the case of children and youth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will now turn to our guest in the room. And Mr. Hashmi, would you please present to us?
Thank you very much, sir. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sikandar Hashmi, and I serve as an imam at the Kannada Muslim Association in Ottawa, and I'm also a member of the Council of Imams of Ottawa-Gatineau. This evening, I'm here with you as a spokesperson for the Canadian Council of Imams. In the Islamic faith tradition, neither euthanasia nor assisted suicide are supported or encouraged. However, since that matter has already been decided by the Supreme Court, our concerns regarding the legalization of physician-assisted dying center around the preservation and the sanctity of life, as well as the vulnerability of patients. Most Canadians would agree that life is sacred and an effort should be made in most, if not all circumstances, to preserve it. The Quran highlights the importance of saving a life in verse 532, quote, "Whoever saves a life, it is as if they have saved humanity entirely." We understand that in some cases, patients experiencing extreme levels of pain and suffering, and those expecting the same in the future, may desire an end to their life. We empathize with them, and as we draw from our faith, we are instructed to pray for them to gain relief from their suffering and to try our best to make them comfortable by providing the best possible care. Our concern is that the availability of the option to die with the assistance of another individual may, in some cases, be subject to the interests of others rather than the patient, leading to direct or indirect encouragement and promotion of physician-assisted dying. We believe that there must be robust safeguards in place to ensure that this option is exercised only by those who voluntarily and independently choose physician-assisted dying after going through an informed decision-making process. We propose that any such requests be considered and evaluated by an end-of-life team of 4 members. Firstly, a physician, ideally one who is familiar with the medical history of the patient and is involved in treating the patient. Secondly, a psychiatrist or psychologist who is able to understand the mental state of the patient and the reasons for their decision. Thirdly, a social worker who can inform the patient about care options available to them and discuss potential impacts of their choices upon themselves and on their family members. And finally, a spiritual care provider representing the faith tradition of the patient who can offer spiritual counsel and advice if the patient desires their services. This team shall ensure that all care options available to the patient have been clearly explained without bias, that the patient has made the decision voluntarily and without duress or encouragement from another party, that the patient understands the impact of their decision, and that the patient's immediate family members are informed, if possible, about this process, and counseling is offered to them unless explicitly requested otherwise by the patient. Furthermore, we recommend that Section 241A of the Criminal Code of Canada be amended to ensure that encouragement to commit suicide, including physician-assisted death, remains a criminal offense. In our view, a patient should be able to seek the assistance of a physician to end their life only if they meet all of the following criteria. They're above the age of majority in their jurisdiction, they're capable of for personal care, they're suffering from grievous and irremediable medical condition, they're in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability, and they experience regular and unbearable physical suffering, which cannot be relieved in a manner the patient deems tolerable. The patient should be required to sign a request form, or in the case of a disability, express their wish clearly in unambiguous terms through any other means. The process and procedures could be as follows: that the patient would inform the care provider of their request or of their desire for care or for physician-assisted death. The end-of-life care team would visit the patient to assess eligibility and inform them about available choices. The team would contact family members, inform them about the request, and offer them support unless requested otherwise by the patient. The team would make a follow-up visit to the patient, and if the patient chooses physician-assisted dying, the team would have them sign appropriate forms. The request would be submitted to the healthcare provider. The healthcare provider would arrange for the time, location, and physician who is willing to assist the patient in dying. Details of this would be shared with immediate family members, unless requested otherwise by the patient. Before the procedure, the end-of-life care team would once again confirm the decision with the patient if the patient is still able to communicate. If the response is in the affirmative, the physician would assist the patient in ending their life, and the death would be reported to a central federal registry. Physicians and faith-based care facilities should not be compelled, in our view, to perform this procedure if their conscience, faith, and personal values do not allow for the taking of life. We would like to highlight the College of Family Physicians of Canada's statement on issues related to end-of-life care, which states, quote, "As a matter of social justice, all Canadians should have access to palliative care that meets national standards. Palliative care must be available in all healthcare settings. In addition, a variety of settings must be available for end-of-life care." We also echo their call for sufficient funding to ensure that all Canadians have access to palliative care that meets national standards and the needs of each community. The teachings of our faith lead us to believe that every disease has a cure. We just have to work to find it. Therefore, we recommend placing a greater emphasis on medical research towards finding cures and better pain management methods, particularly through increased funding and reversal of cuts to programs such as the combined MD-PhD programs, for which funding was withdrawn in June of 2015. In conclusion, we would like to reiterate that neither euthanasia nor assisted suicide are supported or encouraged in the Islamic faith tradition. We believe there is a need and an opportunity to improve quality of life for patients and to protect the vulnerable. We hope our suggestions are useful in developing legislation that is balanced and compassionate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, committee members, we have three panels, so would you be very clear in who you're directing your question to? Mr. Arsenault.
First, yes, I'd like to ask my question to Dr. Davis about age, concernant l'âge des enfants mineurs.
Concerning the age of minors, I'll be very brief. How can you determine the capacity of a child to determine that type of issue. Is it the same as when you deal with an adult, or is it different, yet you are dealing with exactly the same action, the same thing?
Thank you. Is that the end of the question?
Yes.
So basically, in assessing the capacity of a minor person, we are trying to establish that they can have a full understanding of the information, that they can process all the different alternatives available to them, and make a decision that is reproducible if we have the same conversation with them again. So what we're trying to establish is that they have an adult level of maturity and reasoning. I think the difficulty is the younger the child is, the more issues may be at play in terms of trying to please others, including their parents and sometimes their religious and spiritual advisors, even beliefs they may have about what is good for their family or what will be good for their siblings, for example. And I think this is the reason that very often when it comes down to a life and death decision, it's very often referred to the court because those sorts of things are not clear, and I think that healthcare teams often want to refer to higher authority for that decision to be made if the child is at risk of losing their life.
Merci.
Thank you. I appreciate the fact that in your document you referred to the fact that Carter states that the facts led to this decision and left the door open, as other interveners have said, to other possibilities. I'm coming back to the issue of age again. Is there a consensus in pediatrics as to what should be the minimum age at which there can be no free and enlightened consent by a child?
Consensus, even across provincial jurisdictions, the age of consent varies greatly from 14 to 18. And I think capacity really comes down to the individual patient with the individual question that's being asked of them. And in general, the less weighty the outcome of the decision, the more we allow the minor to play a role in that decision. So for example, for a very young child, it may be which arm would you like your intravenous started in, because the risk of harm is so low. But for something as great as a child not wanting potentially life-saving chemotherapy if they have a good prognosis, or not wanting any further treatment if they have just suffered from a terrible car accident, for example, these are the cases that are much more difficult to assess.
1 minute. Toujours à ce sujet.
On the same subject, in your experience as a professional, have you had a case, say an accident case, or where a very young child had to refuse some sort of medical treatment, had to make a decision about it, and you had, what age would that have been if you had an instance like that?
We have had a case where it was a catastrophic accident. The teen in question was 17 years of age, so qualified as a child at the beginning of the illness. And without saying too much more for the sake of confidentiality, a decision was made to treat that child in the immediate time after his accident, despite his opposition.
Mr. Cooper?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is directed to Dr. Raji. Dr. Raji, from your experience, do all GPs have the training necessary to diagnose psychiatric conditions?
So by training, yes, all GPs as part of the training, they can make diagnosis of a psychiatric condition. Sometimes when it's not a straightforward psychiatric condition, a consultation, they may refer the individual for a consultation.
Well, how do you know if it's straightforward or not straightforward? I guess if it's not straightforward, maybe you could explain that.
So by straightforward, I mean following. So the way we make diagnose. Right. So when we follow clinically, there is a textbook with very clear criteria about how to make a diagnosis of a major depressive disorder or schizophrenia. When the presentation is not consistent with one of the criteria, or the set of the criteria, when the differential, what we call the differential diagnosis, is complex, when it's not clear is this a depressive episode with psychosis or schizophrenia, then a referral typically is referred for diagnostic clarification. So when the clinical presentation does not fit in one category, simple category.
The Nova Scotia College of Physicians and Surgeons recently issued a standard of practice, and in their standard of practice, it provides that where the grievous and irremediable condition is a mental illness, that either the first or second physician must be a psychiatrist. I guess my question to you would be, in terms of dealing with a situation where, for example, there may be a grievous and irremediable condition that isn't a mental condition, but the person suffers from some sort of psychiatric condition which goes to the question of capacity. In those situations, is a psychiatric opinion necessary? And also, would a GP, for example, have the ability to, I guess, tease out, on the one hand, the issue of a grievous and irremediable condition from that of a psychiatric condition, which may be the underlying motivation for the request?
That's a great question. We also discussed that at our panel at CAMH. I think it's critical to have a comprehensive capacity assessment for someone who has a mental illness, but they are suffering from non-mental illness, which could be the grievous and irremediable condition. Because, as you are suggesting, I think it would be critical to evaluate whether the decision or the request for PAD, for example, is being driven by the mental illness itself or the view of their physical illness. How much is it influenced by the mental illness? And that's something we as psychiatrists we engage in even now with different types of decision. For example, once one of my patients who has a chronic, let's say, mental illness, they develop cancer, and then they are the oncologist would consult me to see if the decisions being made around the cancer treatment are influenced by the comorbid mental illness, schizophrenia, and whether the refusal or acceptance of a treatment, how much is it influenced by the cognitive and the distortions or the beliefs that are driven by the mental illness.
Mr. Rankin.
Chez Madame Sans Souci, puis on va commencer.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais partager mon temps avec Monsieur Rankin. Je remercie les témoins pour leur présentation. Ma question s'adresse aux représentants du Centre de toxicomanie et de santé mentale. Monsieur l'imam nous a dit que, selon lui, la demande devrait être présentée devant un comité formé de 4 membres. D'autres témoins nous ont dit un médecin.
I ask you to stop for a second, please. Apparently the translation is not working.
Oh.
Shall I begin again? I was thanking the witnesses for their presentation. My question is for the representatives from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. The imam has said that patients should present themselves to a committee made up of 4 persons. Other doctors and other witnesses have talked about a committee made up of a doctor, a judge, or a mental health professional. I would like you to tell us how such a committee should be made up, and also if that aspect should be part of the provincial and territorial legislation in the future that would follow on the federal decision.
Thank you for the question. I will address the issue of maybe the participation of a psychiatrist in these committees, and maybe Kristen can also talk about the other potential members of such committees. I think, and that's also something we discussed in our panel at CAMH, I think for individuals who don't have a mental illness before developing a physical, let's say physical, that is a remediable and grievous illness, it is not always necessary, I think, to have a psychiatrist as part of the panel. However, many of the individuals who develop a terminal illness will develop a new mental illness, let's say in the form of a major depression or sometimes form of a psychosis. So if there is a suspicion by the treatment team, the primary treatment team, that there is a psychiatric condition that either happened before the physical illness or after the physical illness, I think engaging a psychiatrist at that level and as part of the panel would be important. Related to my previous answer, to assess extensively and in depth the issue of capacity.
With respect to the team that would be involved in the decision making along with the patient to actually see whether or not the criteria was met, I think my friend has addressed that. Where we would consider a panel or a board, such as the Consent and Capacity Board here in Ontario, would be where decision making was either required to be appealed, the patient who was making the request was refused by the clinical team, the advisory team who was in place. So a place to go where the issues or the point of contention could be heard and properly addressed. So the makeup of that committee, I mean, here in Ontario we have a psychiatrist or a medical practitioner, a layperson, as well as a lawyer. The combination seems to make sense. The competencies of that tribunal could certainly address these types of issues, although extremely complex and certainly new to that board. The other aspects, perhaps if it's not an appeal, but there are certainly issues that come up in the context of the process itself, we would look to that board or that tribunal as well.
Thank you. I'd like to just build on what my colleague asked you with the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Same question, I suppose, in a different way. Ontario has a Consent and Capacity Board, as you referenced, as a review mechanism. But of course, the only other province or territory that has a similar one is the Yukon Territory. So I'm just wondering what you would suggest, what alternatives might provide similar safeguards elsewhere in Canada. And secondly, are you suggesting that we create a board federally so we have consistency, or leave this to the provinces and territories?
To answer the first part of your question, I believe all provinces and territories do have health professions appeal boards of some sort. So whether or not it's a consent and capacity board, there are health appeal boards where decisions or issues that come up in the clinical setting or healthcare setting would go. I don't have my jurisdictional chart on that, but that's where I would look if there isn't a tribunal or a board specific to the mental health and the consent and capacity aspects.
Would you sum up quickly, please?
Sorry, in the second part of the question, I missed the second part of the question.
In that case,
sorry, I hope I.
Federal or provincial?
Sorry, federal.
You can provide it later in writing. Could you
provide the answer in writing later?
Yes, we'd be happy to do that. I apologize.
Senator Seidman.
I'd like to address my question to Dr. Raji of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Dr. Raji, my understanding from my documentation here is that you're chief of geriatric psychiatry.
Yes.
And in that case, you may be well placed to answer an issue or at least to give us your opinion on a question that has recurred. With regard to advance directives, in countries that permit PAD, individuals with mental health issues, including dementia, that their decision-making capacity are treated differently with regard to advance directives. In the Netherlands, patients are permitted the use of advance directives to outline their wishes while they're competent. In the U.S., they're not. Quebec originally included advance directives, but then removed it from the final version of their bill. So should our committee consider advance directives to ensure the will of individuals who lack capacity are able to access PAD?
This is a question that also I think we are starting to discuss at our panel at CAMH, and I don't think we have a clear recommendation, specific recommendation at this point, because I think the complexity of the issue is that the capacity changes, and that's why the advanced directives are important. And when individuals may wish to have PAD, at that time they may not have the capacity to execute it. However, the wish itself also could change. And I mean, from clinical perspective, again, while dementia has probably a more predictable course and kind of a neurodegenerative course in terms of the natural history compared to what I presented, it's also hard to predict what the mental state of the individual would experience. It's not, again, black or white when they are incapable to make these decisions. I've seen individuals who are in late stage of dementia where they are quite content just to sit in a chair and are smiling, and they, in some sense, the neurodegeneration didn't result in severe anxiety or pain, and they are dependent in their functions, but they seem to be content, and versus other individuals who had different course, and they exhibit severe suffering at the later stage of the illness. So I think I'm sharing the complexities of the issue rather than sharing a specific recommendation that the wish may change the mental state of the individual, even though they may be lacking a capacity. But the suffering itself may differ, may be different between when the individual is capable and projecting and imagining what would be like for them when they are in an advanced stage based on what they know on other individuals versus what actually could happen 10 years down the road from when the diagnosis is made.
So we had quite a stark presentation the other day about the last year of life of someone with dementia. It's probably in all of our minds. We were asked to think about how we would feel with a family member who had dementia, or even ourselves, and would we want to ensure that we wouldn't have to endure this terribly stark picture of the last year of life with the privilege of being able to, in advance, say we wouldn't want to with an advance directive while we were competent, and that in fact someone might end their life far earlier while they were still competent, if they didn't have the assurance that they'd be able to provide an advance directive.
No, I understand the complexity of it, and I think there need to be a more in-depth discussion, I think, about the advanced directive in such individuals. So it is not a black or white.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just need to put you on the spot. But.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Joyal.
I think.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to address my question to the Canadian Pediatric Society, in particular to Ms. Mary Sheriff, because my question deals with the status of the Canadian law in relation to minor in reference to health services, and it might be easier for you maybe to comment. I would like to refer to you to a decision of the Supreme Court of 2009. It's a Supreme Court decision, a majority Supreme Court decision that you probably know because it's titled AC against versus Manitoba Director of Child and Family Services. whereby the Attorney General of Manitoba, the one of British Columbia and Alberta have intervened in the case. I would like to quote you paragraph 46 of the decision, whereby the court stated the following, and I quote, "Common law has more recently abandoned the assumption that all minors lack decisional capacity and replace it with a general recognition that children are entitled to a degree of decision-making autonomy that is reflective of their evolving intelligence and understanding. In other words, they have the right to make those decisions, varies in accordance with the young person level of maturity, with the degree to which maturity is scrutinized intensifying in accordance with the severity of the potential consequences of the treatment or of its refusal." So in other words, it's not a blanket exclusion. They say as much important is the decision for the young person to make, as much more demanding is the scrutinizing of a various sets of criteria that the court has stated at paragraph 96. There are 7 of them. So it seems to me that we cannot exclude, as you suggested, from a blanket decision that all the youngsters below 18 would not be competent. I think they would be competent, but the test of analyzing their competency would be more stringent, because the decision and the impact of the decision, of course, we know it's about life. And life especially is one of the 7 criteria that the court had established in that decision. So it seems to me that if we are to legislate in relation to the age, or to the, I should say generally, the criteria of accessibility, I think we have to take into account that decision of the Supreme Court that is very recent, 2009.
I absolutely would agree with you. I think one of the things that I'm trying to point out is that there's a distinction between the procedure for assessing capacity and the substantive criteria, right? So yes, we have a procedure in place that can assess the decision-making capacity with children, but that doesn't actually answer the question whether or not minor children or non-adults, so children and teenagers or adolescents, should be able to be given access to physician-assisted death in the first place. That there's a huge ethical component and ethical data that was not available at the Supreme Court with respect to children that was available with respect to adults. So the Supreme Court decision didn't just rest on an adult's capacity to choose physician-assisted death. It actually rested on a number of different evidentiary bases to determine, when the arguments were made under Section 7, life, liberty, and security, there's issues around dignity, burden on other people, and so on and so forth. We haven't heard any data with respect to what is a child's feelings in terms of when they have a particular type of illness. So I think what I'm trying to say is, yes, absolutely, we have processes to assess a child's capacity, but we have not looked at the substantive question of whether or not they should be given that access in the first place from that ethical data perspective, which would involve consultation with pediatricians, with families, with children, and then take the next step in looking at the issue of process and determining whether or not then do they indeed have the capacity to make that decision.
Well, Mr. Bruce?
Does that make sense?
Well, I have a different opinion, but I don't think I have the time to expose it.
Mr. Bruce.
Thank you. I would like to direct my question to Dr. Raji of CAMH. All right, I'm going to move this so I can see. Tonight we've talked about a couple of different scenarios involving mental health, and I would like your clarification as to how you see the difference between them, and particularly in how that applies for eligibility. So we have scenario, perhaps, where there is a person who has a mental health issue. I think schizophrenia was used as an example tonight, and considers the situation to be grievous, irremediable, and the enduring suffering is intolerable. And that person is requesting physician-assisted dying. And another scenario would be a request from a person who has some type of a terminal illness, but has also an overlay of having a mental health disorders or health issues, such as, I'm going to use schizophrenia example again. So can you perhaps tell us if you see a difference in what that might be for eligibility and how that might impact?
Yes, so to give kind of concrete hypothetical example, so if someone has an illness like schizophrenia and they are in acute episode psychosis and they are requesting, they are thinking of death or requesting suicide or requesting PAD, and it's because a hypothetical belief that if they don't die, then the whole planet is going to turn into dust. So there is a delusional belief that's driving the suicidal ideation or the request in that case. So this is where the capacity assessment is important to differentiate whether is it driven by a delusion, by the distortion of the mental that's driven by the mental illness or not. The similar scenario could happen with someone who, and I can think of, I'm going to change a bit the example for the privacy, but someone who has schizophrenia but then developed cancer and they are refusing, and it's a treatable cancer, but they are refusing the treatment because they believe that if they get the treatment, then their sibling would get the cancer. So here in this case, the decision to receive a treatment, or in this case, if they are requesting PAD because of the cancer, is driven by a delusion that if they don't die, then their sibling would get the cancer. So I think this is where it's important to engage a psychiatrist to assess the capacity, whether the request for PAD is, how much of it is driven by a delusional thinking. I hope this answers your question.
Thanks. But assuming that the person does pass a capacity assessment, so that the person does have capacity, and you have those two scenarios again, what would be the impact on eligibility?
So in the case where someone is requesting PAD because of schizophrenia, this is where I think the irremediable nature of the illness is not clear. We can't define it clearly, because the example I gave is that when individuals are not acutely psychotic, but they see that they have the belief that they are suffering from an illness that there is no hope that they will recover from. And because this belief now about themselves, their view of themselves, is not psychotic by medical terminology, but it is driven by the social factors that contributed to this belief, because they've been abused since they were kids. Maybe they've been bullied, and then they lost their jobs because the person who was hiring them couldn't understand how to deal with someone with mental illness. So there is all of this, the beliefs of worthlessness, of helplessness and hopelessness that individuals with mental illness do build up over time, and these beliefs are malleable. That's the recovery-based approach that I refer to, that they could be intervened.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in though, because there are two parts. So you're discussing vulnerabilities, which is absolutely part of what we must investigate as to how to protect vulnerable people. But there's the initial question of just eligibility, which is, could a person who has capacity, but in these two different situations, could they, in your mind, be eligible under the Carter test?
So in the first example, it's hard to make a case for eligibility just because of the mental illness, because the belief may probably be driven still by the mental illness or the implications of the mental illness that they are subjected to. In the second example, they could be eligible if clearly the illness is not contributing to the capacity, and they are suffering from a terminal illness where the physical illness is considered irremediable by a board or by consensus or by the physician. So the difference is that in mental illness, it's hard for us to see when, just because of mental illness, the condition could be irremediable.
Thank you. Mr. Albright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all of our witnesses. My first question I'm going to direct to Mr. Hashmi. Thank you, Mr. Hashmi, for drawing attention to what I believe is a foundational concept that all of us as committee members need to have, and that is the basic intrinsic dignity of all human beings, regardless of deformity or disability. We are blessed to have many Canadian doctors of many faiths, and I'm sure many in your community are medical physicians. Would you care to comment on what degree of conscience protection you would like to see in the legislation, given the fact that we have the Carter decision? We would rather it wasn't there, but it's there. What kind of conscience protections would you like to see this committee include in the recommendations to our government?
Thank you. We would say that there definitely should be protection for individual physicians who want to avoid any type of participation in this type of procedure, and would also extend that to healthcare facilities which are faith-based to ensure that again, it's a balance of rights, right? So those who want to stay away at whichever degree they feel is important for them and their faith and their conscience, that they have the ability to do so.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My next question is to the Pediatric Society. I want to be sure that I heard you correctly. I thought I heard you say that the Provincial and Territorial Expert Advisory Group did not consult with the Canadian Pediatric Society before they made their recommendations. Did I hear you correctly?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Are you aware of any other stakeholder groups? And I believe the Pediatric Society of Canada certainly is an important stakeholder group. Are you aware of any other stakeholder groups that may have been excluded from consultation in the formulation of the recommendations by the Provincial Territorial Expert Advisory Panel?
As far as concerns children, I'm not aware of any consultation with any child advocacy group, any child protective service, the Canadian Pediatric Society. Mary, is there anything that you can add?
Aware.
No.
Thank you. And I guess it's concerning for me as a committee member to realize that, especially when many times during these consultations we have heard the phrase, Carter is a floor, not a ceiling, and yet you as the Pediatric Society are recommending that we not go beyond Carter. I think that's very informative. My last question would be to the Canadian Association for Center for Addiction and Mental Health. You indicated that you provide care for up to 30,000 patients who are dealing with various mental health challenges. You also indicate that it's difficult to say conclusively whether or not these conditions may or may not be irremediable. You comment about chronic and episodic features of mental illness, talking even about schizophrenia could in some cases be overcome to the extent that maybe not cured, but at least strong coping mechanisms. And I was so encouraged to hear in your testimony say that you focus on hope, because I think one of the conditions of what this committee is charged with is providing that hope. And part of providing that hope, in my opinion, is to be sure that we are not opening the door for those who may be vulnerable, especially in the mental health challenged group. And because of the episodic nature and the potential for changing of mind and so on, can you assure us that we can actually put adequate safeguards in place to be sure that one of those, even if it's 1% of the 30,000, is not allowed to end their life prematurely, unintentionally, because of an episodic issue with depression? We were informed earlier by some of our witnesses that the concept of safeguards might actually be an illusion. And I'm just wondering if you could comment as to whether or not we can be sure as committee members that we can, in fact, put adequate safeguards in place.
That is a big ask. This is one of the areas that we've talked about at our working group, which is the concept of vulnerability for our patient population. And as we talked about earlier, the social determinants of health being part of the sense of hopelessness in patients suffering from mental illness, in particular depression. And the safeguards, I think, that you're being asked to craft do need to take into account that there will be people who are seeking this type of assistance as part of their illness in ending their lives prematurely. I think one of the safeguards that we are considering is that clinicians here have the ability to conscientiously object based solely on our focus on hope and recovery, because as we've gone through our discussions, the clinicians are struggling with when do our conversations with our patients and our treatment take a 180-degree turn and start to talk about, okay, so let's talk about how we could end your life today.
Could you wrap your answer up, please? Can you sum it up quickly?
Yes, sorry. Yes, sum it up is you have a very large task ahead of you, and anything we can do to assist, we are happy to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Albright. Senator Nancy Ruth.
Senator Seidman, you got a question?
Yes. Are you deferring your time to me?
Deferring your time to her?
Yes.
Senator Seidman.
Okay, thank you. I believe it was Canadian Pediatric Society, so perhaps it was Mary Sharif. You spoke about first iteration of Canadian physician-assisted death legislation. And in light of our discussion here about data oversight, monitoring, and input to a legislative process, I was interested in the idea that you used the concept of the first iteration, because I had a feeling that you were thinking about a second iteration or a third iteration. So might you please explain why you use that language and what it implies?
I use that language because Carter can be construed very narrowly, right? And it seems to me that there seems to be a discussion, a preemptive discussion for including other individuals such as children, minors, other types of conditions, for example, through the advance directive, all in at this time preemptively in anticipation that there might be a charter challenge. And we know that there could be a charter challenge simply because of the nature of the arguments that were made in Carter. Many arguments can be made on the Section 7 right to life argument that unless I have this down the road, I will take my life sooner, right? So many things can fall into that. So I guess because there wasn't any data before in the Carter case with respect to minors, for example, with respect to there was no discussion on advance directive, and I know there's this idea floating around about this idea of floor and ceiling. I'm not particularly fond of that analogy, I think, or that metaphor, or whatever you would call it. I think that we need data. We need to understand. Even when Belgium, which there's controversy around Belgium, but we're really looking at something similar to a Belgium scheme. I think right from the outset, at the beginning of the trial decision, we're looking at a Dutch-Belgium scheme in Canada. That's there's no secret to that. And even Belgium, when they looked, for example, to children, they put their law in place in 2002. They didn't start thinking about minors, other than emancipated minors, until 12 years later. So they had time to actually gather data, look at the evidence, and that data around minors is simply not before the before the Supreme Court. And the decisions and the arguments around Section 7, Section 15 are based on experiences with respect to adults who are requesting a particular service, termination of life service, and we don't know in the essence of those arguments how they're transferable to minor children. Simply as that. So when I say first iteration, it's I'm not sure if the argument is that this is only necessary.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
If we can move forward with this, because there's only a handful of people that it involves, then let's be prudent and not rush to put all in and gather some information. We're Canada. We're not Netherlands. We're not Belgium.
So you're saying the strictest interpretation of Carter to begin with, perhaps in the first round of legislation, data monitoring and input into maybe an update to the legislation. Is that what you're suggesting?
Something to that effect.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Senator Cowan.
I don't know whether I'm going to be cut off here in the 2 minutes or not. We'll try. Because I had my questions were for the Canadian Pediatric Society as well.
Keep going.
In your presentation, you talked about the first iteration and the need to be very careful here if we are to go beyond the adult capacity into younger persons. But I was reading the Bioethics Committee practice point document, which was originally posted in April of 2011 and was reaffirmed just on the 1st of February of this year. And it dealt with withholding and withdrawing artificial nutrition and hydration. And I look at a couple of them. I look at point 6 and point 7. And in those cases, they say medically provided fluids and nutrition may be withdrawn from a child. Medically provided fluids and traditions can be withdrawn from children when such measures only prolong and add morbidity to the...
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Keep talking.
Okay. How do you square that circle? How do you reconcile the presentation which you're making here tonight, urging us to be very careful and not to go beyond above the floor, if you like, and the document which was originally posted in 2011 and then reaffirmed just the other day?
Can I take it?
Yes, I'm going to give this to Mary.
It's a simple answer. Carter doesn't limit to terminal illness, to a terminal phase of a terminal illness. So those are cases where, with respect to withdrawal of nutrition, hydration in a child who is terminally ill. Simple. So Carter is not just about terminal illness.
Oh, so that's the basis for your distinction on whether or not the illness is terminal?
One.
Okay, what's else?
Well, with respect to what you're specifically, and then,
yeah. No, I think that would be an hour lecture unto itself. The difference between euthanasia and assisted dying is completely different than withdrawing treatments, medically provided treatments that can confer no benefit to a child. And all I can say is that ethically and legally that's very clear, and I just don't think we have time to get into the particulars, but I feel very well versed in both of those if we need to have further communication.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator?
I had one question to begin for Imam Hashmi. And I thank you for outlining for us what you would see as a process under Carter. But one question I had for you is an issue that we've seen come up is the issue of effective referrals. So if you saw a doctor who might conscientiously object because of faith issues or any others, we had a suggestion from the BC Civil Liberties Association that one option would be for the doctor to not refer to someone else, but to report to someone within the hospital setting, I have refused or I've objected to a treatment. That's all that they do, and then someone would step in. Does that seem like a system that would be agreeable to you?
I think so. I mean, again, we have to respect the rights of the doctors or the healthcare providers with regards to their beliefs and their conscience. But at the same time, we have to respect the Carter decision as well and the individual rights of the patients. So in that case, yes, if a physician went to the supervisor or whomever within the organization and told them that this is the request that has come to me, now you take care of it, I think that should be fine. And also in the proposed end-of-life team that we were talking about, if a request was made, then this team could go and present options. And I think for many doctors, at least from the Muslim faith, that perhaps would not present a problem because they are talking about the options that are available and they're not just talking about one option, which is physician-assisted death. So I think I don't really foresee any issues with regards to that.
Thank you. My other questions were, in fact, for the person who has now been cut off.
And for the benefit of everyone here, it was at the other end at the conference center.
Is he coming back?
We are trying to make a connection, and there's no return on the contact.
but you could ask the question, and then it's on the record, and we can get a written response from them. So that's...
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. So my question would be for Dr. Raji, and the question is in describing the scenarios and the assessment of whether something, an illness is irremediable. I'm not sure that it's been taken into account the fact that Carter does not require a patient to accept treatment. So I would like to have his assessment again on the eligibility question for mental health issues, somebody who has purely a mental health issue or an overlying mental health issue with a terminal illness, in the scenario where the patient under Carter does have the right to say that they do not want to pursue any further treatment for the mental health issue.
Thank you. The clerks will be in touch and see if we can get an answer for you on that. Thank you very much. The co-chair has been granted the next Liberal turn in the cycle, and I'm turning the question over to him.
And similarly, I would like to ask the CAMH officials, Dr. Raji in particular, how do they engage patients in the working group that they've established on physician-assisted dying? How many patients are on their committee, and what has the patient response been to the questions raised? I would similarly ask the Canadian Pediatric Society how they involve and engage children in the discussion of their health issues. You have referred to something called ethics data. Having studied ethics post-secondary, a number of courses, I have no idea what ethics data is. And if you could explain ethics data, not ethical data, or ethic data, I wasn't sure what you said, what that actually means. I Googled it and I couldn't find an answer even. And also, again, how you engage children. Manitoba has a very robust plan for the way they engage children in some health research, and I'm wondering how you have done it to get specifically the position you presented tonight.
Okay, I'll start. I think it wasn't my piece of the submission, I don't think, and we didn't mean to be misleading or confusing in any way. I think suffice to say that the Canadian Pediatric Society has not had any discussion about this as a group yet, in that the provincial and territorial findings were only released at the end of November. In terms of how we include children and families in decision-making, many hospitals have
children who have rights, specifically children, not families, children.
Okay, so I mean, for any decision, I'll give you the example for chemotherapy, for example. Explaining the chemotherapy, what's entailed, what will be happening to the child is sort of proportional to how much the child wants to hear, how much the child wants to give over to the parents. No?
Excuse me, I think I wasn't clear. You've presented a position tonight, and I'm wondering how you've involved children in developing your policy position, which both of you have articulated. I understand children's involvement in their care decisions, but in your policy decision, you've spent quite a bit of time articulating a policy decision tonight. Maybe they're personal opinions. I thought they were actually from your organization, so I might be confused on that. Are they personal or are they organizational?
They're organizational in that we had 6 days to pull this together. It has been to the executive of the CPS, and we decided to stick to the sort of the overarching themes that we wanted to get across, about which we thought there would be consensus. And what we want to be clear about is there has been absolutely no discussion with healthcare professionals, children, families across the country about this issue, and for that reason we think it would be absolutely premature to include it, as it's not prescribed by Carter that we do so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Reggie, can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Okay. While you were offline in inner space, we had two questions that were directed to you. The clerks will be in touch with you with the written question, and we would appreciate you getting back to us in the briefest possible delay. Is that fine with you?
Very fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last question will go to Mr. Albrecht.
Again, Mr. Chair, I just want another question to the Canadian Pediatric Society. You point out that quality palliative care must be accessible for children and youth, and you extrapolate from some British Columbia data, which indicates that 10 out of every 10,000 children are in need of palliative care services, and yet with that very low number, 10 out of 10,000, you indicate that only 5 to 12% would have benefited from palliative care services in terms of what was available to them. So I think you're pointing out to this committee, again, the extremely low level of palliative care options that are available, especially in terms of palliative care for children. And we know in a general sense from the expert advisory panel that only 55 out of 77,000 Canadian physicians are specialists in palliative care. So these two very concerning issues, I think, point out the need that we need to do better. My question would be, are you saying in your submission that for physician-assisted death to be offered, before that happens, we have to at least be able to offer extensive palliative care options to children who may in the future be requesting this procedure?
Yes, and I think that's a personal opinion, but I think I can also speak on behalf of the CPS. That's exactly what we're saying. That is, it's absolutely premature that we would expect that a child should be able to ask to end their life when we have completely inadequate national palliative care services available for children. And just for the record, there's less than 20 full-time physicians in Canada that are providing specialized palliative care services to children, and very many frontline community health professionals, be it family doctors or home care nurses, are completely devoid of any training or experience in caring for children with life-limiting illnesses.
And thank you. I may have missed in your earlier presentation or your response to a question, what is your current definition of an adult? Is it 18 or something other than that?
I think for the purposes of your legislation, I would say 18 is an adult.
Okay, thank you.
I would be as conservative as you can possibly be.
I like you being conservative. I'm going to share the rest of my time with Mr. Warwa.
Thank you. I want to thank Imam Hashmi for being with us. And do you have a handout? Apparently it's not in both official languages, but we could come back and meet with you after the meeting. Would you have a handout that is your testimony?
Yes, we can absolutely make that available.
Thank you. And just a clarification, in the conscious issue, you said that physicians of faith and institutions of faith should not have to be involved. Are you saying participate and not having to refer?
No, they would refer, but we're talking about participation in the practice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is a point of order or not, but we were able to overcome the technical difficulty, and although I agreed with sharing, or we moved on to share. I just wonder, we have the others back online, and could we get the two questions that were asked just answered really quickly? I think it would help all of us to hear instead of waiting for a written deliberation.
I'll put it to the committee. You're agreed?
Yeah.
Thank you, committee. Okay, Dr. Reggie, you're going to be back on, and let's see. The first one was from Mr. Bruson, and the second one was from the co-chair. So,
all right.
Mr. Bruson.
Let me see if I can do this.
If you want time to think, I can ask.
Well, no, I know it. I just a slight variation on how it's said. When you were talking about irremediable, Dr. Raji, earlier, you were talking about the availability of treatments and not being able to assess, how treatments are going to succeed or not. But the Carter decision doesn't actually require a patient to accept treatment. A patient can decide that they do not want to pursue further treatment. And so taking that into account, I was wondering if that would, how you would see that as affecting, again, for a person with mental health issues.
When I was talking about the irremediable nature of the illness, I was linking it to three points or three concepts. One is the natural history of the illness itself, and that is there is no proximity of death or inevitable death that is associated with mental illness, unlike some other medical disorders. So by natural history, for example, 25% of individuals or more from schizophrenia, they may recover if they long enough, and they would recover completely from schizophrenia. So then the second point is the issue of the treatment.
Sorry,
we don't know. We don't know. We don't have enough knowledge about this. Most people would have had some form of treatment, whether it's because of the treatment or because of natural history, because these are longitudinal studies that would take 10 years, 20 years, 40 years sometimes to get to know that knowledge. So it's hard to tell what is causing what. But the same thing. So the other issue is the issue of the suicide, that it does happen, but again, we don't know when it's going to happen, if it's going to happen. We have good knowledge about the risk factors that increase the risk. With this, the third concept or the third point is related to medication, whether someone would respond or not, or someone even without responding to a treatment, would they recover just naturally because of the. We know, for example, from depression, people without taking any treatment of depression, the depressive episodes will eventually. They would recover from it. We don't know exactly when. But the other part of the issue, the second concept or the big concept that related to the irremediable nature of the illness, is that even individuals who have the symptoms, still experiencing the episodic nature of the illness, there is a recovery approach that what we take on to help individuals live with the illness, because of that lack of inevitable and progressive course towards death. So that we have, in some sense, we have the luxury and the hope to be able to work with someone, even if they are refusing treatment. I can think of specific examples of individuals, patients I'm seeing now, last week or so, refusing treatment, but they would still coming to see me, because my point to them is that I will be here if you come back and see me, and so they will keep working on talking about the issues that are related to the treatment or recovery issues, how to live with the illness, that the illness doesn't become.
I think we understand the overall answer to your question, and this could go on for some time. So I'm going to ask Mr. Oliphant to.
I think mine is quicker. I think you said earlier that you have a working group established on physician-assisted dying, and that it is in process. That's correct. How are you engaging your patient population in that? How many patients are on the working group? You have 30,000 patients you treat every year. So how many of them are engaged in your process, and how are they engaged?
So our working group committee is a subcommittee of our medical advisory committee in the hospital. So as we indicated, it's an interprofessional group with legal as well as ethics, and we have a representative from our Empowerment Council, which is a patient advocacy group that works within CAMH but is actually separate from. And their role on our committee, as well as many other committees within our organization and external, is to be the patient voice. We know that they're undertaking. It's one patient representative. But she is undertaking, as part of the Empowerment Council work, consultations external to this committee. So although it's one person who sits on the committee of I think 7 or 8 of us on the working group, the patient voice is being brought to us through this representative.
Would you call it a patient-centric process, as your minister who funds you, Mr. Hoskins, has suggested, that every process in every hospital should be patient-centric? Would you describe that as patient-centric?
Yes, I think so. I think what we've done is we have the clinicians at the table as well as the patient voice, and I can assure you, if she didn't feel that we were doing a good enough job, she would let us know.
Thank you very much. Well, witnesses, thank you very much for your testimony here. You've all been very articulate, and we thank you very much for that. And committee, I thank you for your patience. And with that, I need to remind you, in this room tomorrow night, 4:30 the committee meeting will begin. How it proceeds depends on your House of Commons fellows' decisions tomorrow with regard to their votes. So with that, I declare the meeting adjourned.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for appearing before the committee, and we will be now hanging up. Have a nice day.